I was living in Banff, Alberta, Canada's famous resort town. And I was looking after a doctor's home. And in late March, he got permission from Parks Canada to tear down this old house, which had been his plan all along to rebuild a retirement home. So at the end of March, he came up and announced that I had to leave. And that's the height of ski season, and there is nowhere to live. So I slept in the rink for a couple of nights. And then I'd go to the bar each night and ask everybody if they knew anywhere where I could live. And the town drunk said, "Come and live with me." And he was a storyteller by profession, and I thought, I'm not going to miss this opportunity. And I don't regret it for a minute, because these are the kind of stories he told. So this one's true. When he was 18 years old. Well, and this is how he spoke. Because he didn't have any teeth, and rather than go out and get a job and replace his teeth, he just kept drinking without them. Yeah. Well, when I was 18 years old, I worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway in Banff. My job was to keep the steam locomotives loaded with coal and water so they could make it over the Continental Divide into British Columbia. On Friday, October the 20th, at about 10 o'clock, I said to my fireman, "We should get some beer tonight." And he said, "Well, where are we going to get it?" And I said, "Well, we could phone the taxi and go over to the bootleggers in Canmore." But the taxi man had already gone to bed for the night. Pretty quiet in Banff in October. So my fireman said to me, "Well, I guess we'll have to wait till tomorrow." And I said, "Well, maybe we could go over to Canmore another way." "Well, how would you do that?" "Well, we could take the locomotive." And so we switched 5900 onto the main line, checked with the station agent, nothing on the main line between Calgary and Field, and so off we went to Canmore. Now, for those of you who aren't up on your railway education, I've been mentioning the locomotive 5900. Well, that was the largest steam locomotive ever made for the Canadian Pacific Railway, and naturally it would be stationed in Banff because that's where you cross the Continental Divide. Now, if you'd like to see this, the sister engine, 5934, is at Heritage Park in Calgary. It's a 410-4 locomotive that is in itself a 2-acre museum. Between Calgary and Field, and so off we went to Canmore. Switched onto the spur line, crossed the Bow River, went up past the mine to the bootleggers. Hiked in there and chatted with him for quite a while. Finally, he said to me, "Well, Bruce, I'll bring the beer out to your car." I said, "Well, I didn't exactly come by car. I come by locomotive." And he didn't believe me, so he brought the beer out, went over the knoll, and looked down and said, "Well, that certainly isn't the Canmore yard engine. You know, Bruce, over the years, I've had him come by cross-country ski, snowshoe, canoe, bicycle, but I've never had him come by locomotive before." And so he walked me down. So the bootlegger comes out, gives us our beer, and we have to back down the grade back to Canmore. There's an old mining bridge over the Bow River. He was a little concerned that our locomotive was too heavy. So back down the grade and very slowly got back over the bridge. Nothing much seemed to happen. Next day, though, the engineers figured that the bridge had sagged about 6 inches. Away we went, switched back onto the main line, stopped at the station agent in Canmore, and I asked, "Is anything on the main line?" He said, "Well, there's a freight on the Field Hill coming through the spiral tunnels, and the number 2 passenger train's under a full head of steam heading west from Exshaw. You better get going." So I went pronto, and we were heading back to Banff over the moonlight shining over Mount Rundle. Beautiful night. And on that grade going up to the Continental Divide, my fireman should have been shoveling coal until hell itself wouldn't take any more. But I wasn't getting much steam, and you're not supposed to take your eye off the track, but I looked over at my fireman, who, as I said, should have been shoveling coal till Hades himself didn't want any more, and there he was, sitting with his feet out the window, drinking his beer and watching the moon rise over Mount Rundle. Needless to say, we ran out of steam, stalled on the main line. Now with the passenger train right behind me under a full head of steam, freight coming up from Field, I thought I better set up the aft flares first. So I grabbed the flares and I ran down the track until I'd covered the 1,000 yards that you were supposed to set up the flares on the main line. No sooner had them set up than the passenger train came screeching around the corner, saw the flares, thank goodness, slammed on the brakes, sparks everywhere, could have burnt down the whole park. Skidded right up behind the 5900, but didn't quite touch it, not even a fender bender. So I ran back to 5900, and the engineer looked down at me and he said, "Would you like a push back to Banff?" And I said, "That would be right hospitable of you, sir." And so he pushed me back to Banff. Well, by then, the freight train had had to sidetrack. And as I was pushed by the section agent, he didn't have a sense of humor like the engineer. And he said, "Out for a joyride tonight on the main line, were you, Bruce?" "Well, I used to do the same thing myself when I was your age, didn't think much about it." But the conductor did not share in his sense of humor. Said I would be charged. Well, sure enough, the next morning the Queen's Cowboy arrived. That would be the RCMP. And the Queen's Cowboy arrived at my house and charged me with theft of a locomotive. I was to appear in court in Calgary. So I went all the way to Calgary. See a lawyer named Milt Herons. Now, he was a law student at the time, drove a bus for Brewster's in the summer, so I knew him from conversations we'd had in the bar. And I went in and presented my case to him. And he said, "Bruce, you're in a lot of trouble." And I said, "I know, Milt. That's why I came all the way to Calgary to see you." Well, I didn't think that young whippersnapper would amount to much. But today he's a justice in the Supreme Court and all of Alberta. But in them days, like I said, he was just a bus driver for Brewster's. So we discussed the case at length. Finally, my day in court arrived. My lawyer said he couldn't even show up that day. He had other obligations, but he thought I could handle this one myself. So there I was, 6'2", 135 pounds, Bruce Beatty versus the Canadian Pacific Railway. Most people didn't think the odds were that good. I think everybody in the CPR in Calgary had booked in sick that day because the courthouse was full to the rafters with employees. Judge had the charge read out, looked down at me and said, "Mr. Beatty, how do you plead? Guilty or not guilty? Well, every man has his day in the sun. And even though I was only 18, I knew this was mine. So I took my time, stood as tall as I could, cleared my throat, and said, Your Honor, I plead not guilty. Well, the courtroom erupted in laughter. And the judge couldn't believe my answer. He looked at me as if to say, Are you sure? So he said, Mr. Beatty, how could you possibly plead not guilty? So I looked around the courtroom. You could have heard a pin drop. Waited as long as I could, and then said, Your Honor, it is my understanding of theft that one must leave the premises. And I don't recall putting a 255-ton locomotive in my pocket and leaving the tracks. And as far as I can ascertain, the Canadian Pacific Railway owns those tracks all the way from Banff to Canmore and back. Well, the courtroom erupted in laughter once again. The judge banged his gavel, demanded silence, and asked the prosecutor to meet him in his chamber. They went in there, spent maybe 10 minutes. Imagine they had a couple of drinks. Then they came out, and the judge called for order in the courtroom and dismissed the case. And I walked out a free man.